This is the third video of Section 5, and this video is called Introducing the YII HTML Helper. In the previous video, we learned how we could use asset bundles to manage JavaScript and CSS. One of the main tasks of a server-side framework is to generate HTML markup to display data to the users. This is frequently achieved by writing HTML and then escaping in and out of PHP using opening and closing tags to output dynamic data. The problem is that this can quickly lead to unreadable and unmanageable code. So YII provides us with an HTML helper class whose sole responsibility is to quickly and efficiently generate markup. If you've been developing applications for the web for any period of time, you've most likely heard the expression sanitize input, escape output. The HTML helper can help us with the second part of that equation, escaping output. Let's take a look at why we might want to do this in the first place. We've logged in as the mummy, and we're editing his profile. In the name field, let's actually enter a JavaScript tag as well as some benign code. Save the changes, and you'll see that the code we entered appears as text in the name box on the mummy's view page. The only reason this happens is because the widget that generates this view page uses the HTML helper's encode method on this output. View the source on this page, and you'll see that the HTML helper has converted all of the opening and closing carets to HTML entities, which causes the browser to output our script as text rather than interpreting it as a script and executing it. However, if I open up views, monster, view.php, and make a small change to the name column, I can disable the encode method. Now, if I reload the page, my JavaScript is actually executed and an alert dialog is generated. Imagine if someone replaced my friendly JavaScript with something more malicious. Even Dracula should be frightened by that thought. By the way, these kinds of attacks are called cross-site scripting, or XSS for short. Another way that the HTML helper can assist you is by generating HTML tags, complete with attributes and content. Let's try an example that will demonstrate why you might want to use this feature. Open up Views, Site, Index.php, and look at the HTML that generates the Find Your Match call to action button. You'll see that we already escaped once into PHP in order to generate our href destination using the URL helper. Now, let's imagine that there were also a few other classes that we might need to apply to this button depending on a set of circumstances. We'd have to add another series of inline if-then statements, which could get messy quickly. Instead, let's use the A method of the HTML helper, which is used to generate a link tag. The first parameter is the link text, which in this case is find your match. The second parameter is the URL, which is /monster, and the final parameter is an array of options. Each array key is the attribute name, and the value is the value of that attribute. We'll use it to set the class, which is currently a set of Bootstrap classes. These classes make the link look like a button. But what if we wanted to vary the color of this button? For a moment, let's create an arbitrary circumstance. At the top of our view file, we'll write a small script which first assigns a button class variable a series of CSS classes, which set the size and shape of our button. Then, we'll add a ternary operator that varies the class based on whether the current time in seconds is even or odd. And that will vary whether the button is green or orange. Finally, replace the class assignment in our link generator, and then reload the page several times. We'll see that the class changes depending on the script execution time. If you have ever developed a PHP application without a framework, then you know that one of the most tedious aspects can be working with forms. You need to generate fields, validate data, display errors, and possibly repopulate fields with previously submitted data. We already looked at how ActiveForm is used to generate the forms on our create and update pages. But what you may not realize is that the ActiveForm object simply uses HTML helper's methods to generate each form input. We're going to revisit our About page now, which we've repurposed in a few of our earlier videos in order to demonstrate various features of YII. In fact, when we created a form on this page during the automated testing section, we used ActiveForm to generate all of our form code. Let's improve one of our fields in order to demonstrate a slightly advanced usage of the HTML helper form field methods. If you remember, we had a text input where our users could input a monster's name, which would then be output on form submit. What if, instead of a text input, we wanted to generate a list of radio buttons for each monster stored in our database? We can use the radio list method. The first parameter for this method is the input name, which remains unchanged, monster name. The second is the currently selected radio button. Let's say that because monsters can be a little bit vain, that if one of them is logged in, that their name will be selected by default. Otherwise, we won't select one by default. Because we're trying to keep our HTML as clean as possible, we'll define a variable called selectedMonster in the opening PHP block, and then pass it to the radio list method below. The third parameter is a list of options which will be used to generate both the text and values of each radio button. YII provides another helper object called the array helper, which can be used to build a map, or an array of key-value pairs, which in turn can be used to generate select options for dropdowns, checkbox lists, and radio button lists. The method is appropriately named map. Its first parameter is an array or an array of objects. In this case, let's provide it an array of all the monsters in the system using a finder. The second is the attribute to be used as the radio button's value. The third is the attribute which will be used to generate the options label or text. We'll use the name property for both here. Now, remember to add use statements for both the array helper and monster classes at the top of the page. Now, reload the About page, and we'll see that we have a group of radio buttons with dynamic options and a default selection, and it was all done with just a single line of code. It should now be clear how the HTML helper can help you keep your views more organized and even allow you to write less code. We'll conclude this section in our next and final video by putting together everything we've learned to create a profile detail page for our romantic hopefuls.